Hello, welcome to Miniature Realms. My name's Stuart, and in this video I want to discuss why I think I'm happy that they blew up Warhammer Fantasy way back in 2015. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. Now that thumbnail and that statement will be pretty triggering and pretty controversial for many fans of Warhammer Fantasy, and many people would have already stopped watching this video while hammering the dislike button and maybe even leaving me a rude comment on the way out. But for those of you that are still here, I just want to say right at the beginning of this video, there's context and hindsight to that statement. If I could go back in time to 2015 and I was in charge and I could choose whether I would blow up Warhammer Fantasy, I wouldn't do it. I loved the game and didn't want it to go away. It's more based around the fact we have what I believe is a wonderful addition with Warhammer the Old World and the way it's shaping up now, and then all the things that have gone in between with the other Games Workshop systems. I feel that the world and Old World couldn't have been as good as it is now without it ending back then. Hopefully by saying that at the top of the video, you understand what is meant by that opening statement, what this video is about. It's all about the context. The context is, I love Warhammer the Old World. I really like the place that it's in, and the discussion really is around if Warhammer Fantasy hadn't ended, could whatever Warhammer Fantasy had become be as good as what we have now with Warhammer the Old World. It's as simple as that. I don't hate Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition and all that came before it. I absolutely love it, so I wouldn't really go back in time and destroy it. So as we've explained the context of the discussion, I think let's just briefly cover the context of what happened in 2015 when Age of Sigmar replaced Warhammer Fantasy 8th edition, and I think that's one of the most emotive things to replace. People that really loved Warhammer Fantasy, a lot of them went on and played Age of Sigmar and still do today and are very happy with it. The game looks great. I don't play it myself. I think at the time the whole change away from the old world and the lore, which is the bit I love most, is what upset me most. It wasn't to do with the round bases, but I wasn't angry about it. It was just a change and a business decision that a company made. But it's very interesting about why that decision was made, and I'm not going to go into it in great detail here, but I can definitely recommend the Jordan Sorcery YouTube channel and his interviews with many of the people that worked in the studio at that time, in particular one with Alan Merritt, when he talks about how little money Warhammer Fantasy was making in comparison with Warhammer 40k. They knew they had to do something, and their decision, agree with it or not, was to launch Age of Sigmar. So money was a big thing, and IP is another thing that's also brought up as well, depending on who you listen to and who you speak to. But I think it's very interesting. I think it's undeniable that financially they made the right decision, that Age of Sigmar made them more money. Is there another story, another way that they could have made fantasy just as popular? Maybe, but maybe that's another discussion, but something I'd like to see explored in the comments below. And the launch of Age of Sigmar wasn't all roses either. It was a bit of a mess, I think. And again, Jordan Sorcery, look at his interview with Jervis Johnson. They talk about what they learnt from that first edition, releasing it with no points and all of the things that came with that. They've definitely learned a lot from that and have changed that over the most recent editions. We've just had a 4th edition of it, and it doesn't appear to be going anywhere, as much as some people still seem to wish it would disappear and fantasy would take its place. I really don't care. I'm happy that the old world is here right now, and I'm happy it's its own thing, and that Age of Sigmar is its own thing as well. So back to the question and the statement at the beginning. Why do I, someone who's played Warhammer Fantasy since 3rd edition, it was the game that got me into wargaming, my favourite wargame tabletop fantasy thing ever, probably really. Why am I happy that it ended after this huge, fantastic edition? I mean, this book was amazing. It wasn't my favourite ever edition, but it was probably my favourite book in terms of something to flick through on the coffee table. And if I'm just sitting back now and I relax and thumb through an old Warhammer Fantasy book, this is quite often the one I go for. It's full of beautiful colour pictures on pages all the way through. Got loads of extra content in there that you don't find in other editions. The scenarios, the massive siege in which the table still exists in Warhammer World. You can go and see this set out. And I absolutely love this book. So why do I think it was right to end the game? And while the rules weren't the most perfect edition, the games on the table looked fantastic. Huge units, as much as it was a pain to paint them all. The army books at the time were full colour and hardback, and they looked absolutely stunning. And if you look at it in terms of its presentation, the game looked like it was in a fantastic place. And I guess at its core, it is extremely simple. If you look at what Games Workshop has become over the 8-9 years since the game was ended, you look at the development of Warhammer 40,000 and how Age of Sigmar has developed, I'm not sure that I would have wanted to play a game of Warhammer Fantasy that resembled one of those games today as much as I do the version we do have with Warhammer the Old World. Warhammer 40,000 and of course Age of Sigmar, mirroring it over the years, have changed so much compared to what we were used to back in 2015 and before. Art style has developed and changed, and that's natural. People have left the company and moved on. People like John Blanche are no longer heading up the art team and delivering that direction, and there's nothing wrong with any of the new artwork. It is absolutely stunning, but it is a different feel and has a different era to it. And Warhammer Fantasy, had it continued through a 9th, 10th, 11th edition, would no doubt have changed along with that as well, and maybe would have resembled Age of Sigmar in its art style now with the miniatures that went along with that. And would I prefer that to what we have with Warhammer the Old World, which is almost a reset back to where we were before? That's mirrored in game style and rule style as well. Now, right back when Age of Sigmar first edition launched, I was playing other games, but I didn't pick up the first edition of Age of Sigmar, mostly because the world had changed, the lore had changed. I didn't recognise those new armies. It wasn't because they were on round bases. In fact, I was playing more games like that at the time. And maybe if it was a reskinned Warhammer Fantasy and more of a skirmish style game, I would have picked it up and played it, and it could have been great. But I think if that had happened, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about Warhammer the Old World at all. I don't think it would have existed. Warhammer Fantasy would have just changed into the Age of Sigmar style game, and that would have been sad now in retrospect. At the time, it's what I was calling for and saying, well, why didn't you just keep the world? But actually, if they'd kept the world, it wouldn't have been free now to be re-released. I also really love what they're doing with the lore in Warhammer the Old World by setting it in this new era that's completely recognisable as the Old World, but before any of the major events leading up to the end times. It's given them a lot of design space, but also as players space as well to set campaigns and play our games. And while we're edging towards the Great War of Chaos, which means they can bring something really big into the game, we also know what happens with that. We know it doesn't change the world so much that it still doesn't feel like Warhammer Fantasy afterwards. And it's made some changes that I think are really cool as well, just toning down things a little bit. Chaos being a little bit more undivided. We're seeing Norse raiders. It almost feels a little bit like first edition Warhammer Fantasy roleplay and some of that early fantasy feel as well. Still very much high fantasy compared to Game of Thrones or something, but a lot more low fantasy compared to Age of Sigmar. And I really like that general feel. It feels like Warhammer Fantasy, and would we have that again if the game had continued? I think things would have got bigger and brasher, and we just wouldn't have that fantasy that we recognise and love. Now, there is an elephant in the room and a bit of a caveat to all of this. This whole argument of mine that we couldn't have the old world that we have today, which I love, and many of you do watching this as well, without the old world being blown up in 2015, is we have lost factions. The major caveat is my assumption, and my whole point here is that we are going to have more factions return. Those legacy factions will now come back. That is my belief, but we don't know that for certain. And if they don't come back, that may change my opinion a little bit on this. So there is a big assumption based on this, but I think with all the noise that's come out on the articles over the last few months about the scope of the project improving, I think we will see the majority, if not all, of those factions return. Not for a few years, but I think they will come back. And then with them all back and this new age of Warhammer Fantasy, I can't imagine that being replaced by something that's more Age of Sigmar-ish with round bases and fantasy style. I just can't imagine that what we may have in 2 or 3 years' time could be bettered by fantasy continuing back after 2015. I also think that the specialist design studio having control of Warhammer the Old World has a huge impact, influence on the style of game we have today. The main studio has changed. We've already talked about that and the way it produces things, its style, its personnel even, and it's not the same as the studio was back in 2015. We've seen the specialist design studio grow out of Forge World, and for ages they've been bringing out games that are slightly different to the main studio, maybe catering for an older gamer or people that like that nostalgic game, or something slightly different to the main 40k and AOS gaming. I know a lot of people play both. I'm always conscious of going too far down that route, because you'll end up with the 40k's for kids and heresies for adult stuff, and I hate it. I think that's complete BS, and I don't believe in any of that. They're just different styles of games. But the products definitely appeal sometimes to different people who like different aesthetics and different styles of gaming. And I think that's a perfect fit for Warhammer the Old World, and it gives them the remit to bring out the game in that style. Now, don't get me wrong, it has its negatives as well. It's a smaller part of the business. Its staffing levels are lower, its funding is less. They have less places on the release calendar and production and all those things. It's quite obvious that they have to wait their turn at times, but also maybe that suits us because it helps deliver a slightly slower progress and release schedule, and maybe we won't have a new edition every 3 years, and maybe there won't be a new army book every month, because once these factions are released, let's face it, a slower burn game is probably what most fantasy players are after. So I think the fact that the game is with SDS as well is great. And again, going back, what would have happened if the game had continued to develop in the main studio? They're all great people that have done a good game, but it would have been hugely different. And what I hear from most people is they didn't want fantasy to end, and the old world is very close to what fantasy was back then. And that's pretty much it, really. It's not that I hated Warhammer Fantasy and think Games Workshop were right to kill it off. They had their business reasons for doing it, and that's almost a separate debate. But it's made in the context of today, and loving Warhammer the Old World and where it is now and where it looks like it's going. It's the kind of fantasy that I recognise. It reminds me of this stuff and before. And for me, that is great and exciting. And I just think about it logically and rationally, and I can't see how we could be sitting here in 2024 with a game like that had fantasy carried on its normal path and developed through more editions. I don't think we'd have the kind of game that we're enjoying now. I think it would have changed completely and it would have been gone. And for that reason, I'm happy that they did what they did, even if it means we've gone through a gap of sort of 8-9 years without the fantasy game. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts and theories below. I'm really interested in what people think fantasy may have been like if it kept going, and do they think it would have developed into the kind of game Old World is, or do they think it would have developed into something closer to Age of Sigmar with more of a lore theme based around the fantasy world we knew? I think that that's the only direction it would have gone. That is, again, just opinion, and guess we will never know, but it's always fun to discuss those things. What else could they have done to make fantasy more successful? I know that Jordan Sorcery and I talk a lot about this kind of thing, and the Storm of Chaos, he believes, was a really good place. They could have kept that storyline going and made the game more exciting. We see a potential in the future for Grand Cathay to come in, so there was definitely lots of worlds and areas of the old world that they could have explored and brought even more factions in. Maybe if they got rid of a few factions here or there or changed them, so there would have been ways to freshen up the game and maybe increase the sales that way. So lots of theories, love lots of chat like that. Not too interested in people just bagging on Age of Sigmar and 40k. You can do it if you want. It's the internet, I can't stop you. But that isn't the vibe of what I'm trying to talk about today. I want to try to keep it positive if possible. And just before I let you go, I just wanted to comment a little bit on the news we've heard over the last week or so about Paul Sawyer. So for those of you who don't know who he was, he worked at Games Workshop for a number of years, probably most famous for being editor of White Dwarf, the fat bloke. Many of you watching this, I'm sure, would have grown up through that era of White Dwarf and remember him very, very fondly. After that, he went on to found Warlord Games with John Stallard, and up until this year, he's been working there and running the business along with John, who was taken ill at an event earlier this year. And then this last week or so, we have found out through his own Facebook and also through statements of Warlord Games that unfortunately he won't be returning to work, and unfortunately has stage 4 brain cancer, which he won't be able to recover from, and is spending the rest of his time at home with his family and friends the best he can. I've only met Paul in person a couple of times, and the most memorable being invited by himself and John up to Warlord Games HQ for a sit down and a bit of a chat on the back of the videos that I've made on this channel about their products. And it was so nice to be recognised by them and contacted by them and asked to do that. I had a full personal tour of the studio, meeting the designers, the painters, the people behind the games, with Paul as my host, and then a tour around the factory looking at all the manufacturing and the warehouse. And it's an incredibly cool thing to do anyway, and to do it as a guest of Paul and having him as my guide will go down on my nerd cool list for as one of my most memorable things. And it was really, really cool, and I'll remember it for the rest of my life for sure. I'm just incredibly sad to hear about Paul's diagnosis, and hope that he's able to spend his remaining time with his friends and family and loved ones and best he can. And with all that in mind, I just wanted to draw your attention to a couple of things that you may well have already seen on the internet recently. The first is a GoFundMe set up by his daughter to raise money to help make Paul's remaining time more comfortable. And I think there will be things to help him maintain his life at home for longer and make his final time with his family a little bit smoother and a little bit more comfortable. And I'll pop a link in the video description for you to check that one out if you so wish to donate. And then Warlord Games have also released a commemorative figure of him. Again, there's a little photo going up now, but I'll pop a link to that in the video description below. And if you purchase that miniature from Warlord Games, all the proceeds go to a charity that Paul has chosen. So I'll be back soon with more videos. The next old world content as such will be Warriors of Chaos, a whole army project, and that should be out the following weekend from this video, so do look out for that one. But thank you very much for watching, take care, and I'll catch you soon.